Hello and welcome back to Bookish. It's St. Patrick's Day, so in honor of St. Patrick's Day, I thought I would continue with my look at some of the stories in Dubliners by James Joyce. This is a part of the Dubliners read-along hosted by Alan over at Big Hard Books and Classics, and I'll leave you a link to his latest video in this series in the comment section or the show notes section down below. I've got on my green shirt so my wife doesn't pinch me. Hope it looks green in the video. And I've got my pint of Guinness because I'm doing stereotypical Irish things, which is what we do in the United States of America on St. Patrick's Day. Sláinte. So today I'm going to be doing the story Grace. Grace is the next to last story in Dubliners. And this story is really interesting to me in lots of ways and kind of funny in kind of good-natured, funny ways, and also maybe in a darkly ironic sense. So it deals with drunkenness, it deals a lot with the Catholic Church and faith, the interaction between Protestants and Catholics in Ireland, and it really is just, I think, a really high-quality story that is done in a really brilliant way. So the story begins in a bar and it ends in a church. But the story involves really primarily four gentlemen: Mr. Kernan, Mr. Power, Mr. Cunningham, and Mr. McCoy. There's also Mr. Fogarty, who plays a role in the story later on. The story begins in a bar where we eventually learn it's Mr. Kernan who's fallen down the steps in the bathroom of a bar, and in the process he's kind of landed on his face and he's bitten off a small part of his tongue, which kind of, to me, indicates that maybe there's Joyce is kind of playing around with us here. There's a certain tongue-in-cheek element to his depiction of the people, the events, and the themes of his story. But Mr. Kernan has injured himself, and he is terribly, terribly drunk. It takes a while to establish his identity. All kinds of people try to help him. Eventually, a much younger friend of his, Mr. Kernan is probably in late middle age, a much younger friend of his, Mr. Power, comes to his rescue and is going to call a cab and see him home in that cab and prevent the police from taking an interest in Mr. Kernan's public drunkenness. One of the brilliant things about this story is Joyce's ability to characterize the different men in a few short sentences. So here he is describing the differences between Mr. Power and Mr. Kernan. Hey, Ike. Hey, Zelda. I got dogs with me today. All right. Mr. Power, a much younger man, was employed in the Royal Irish Constabulary Office in Dublin Castle. The arc of his social rise intersected the arc of his friend's decline, but Mr. Kernan's decline was mitigated by the fact that certain of those friends who had known him at his highest point of success still esteemed him as a character. Mr. Power was one of these friends. His inexplicable debts were a byword in his circle. He was a debonair young man. So Mr. Power is a young man on the rise, and Mr. Kernan is an old man in decline. And there's no doubt that drink plays a role in Mr. Kernan's decline. So Mr. Power sees Mr. Kernan home, where he meets Mr. Kernan's long-suffering wife, Mrs. Kernan, and together they kind of hatch a plan for Mr. Kernan's salvation. That's what I'm going to call it. And so a couple of days later, while Mr. Kernan is recovering from his fall at home in bed, Mr. Power, Mr. Cunningham, and Mr. McCoy pay a call on Mr. Kernan, and they go up to the invalid's room and they begin talking to him. And in the course of talking to him, they tell him, or kind of hint, that they were planning on going on a retreat to do what they called washing the pot, that they were going to go on this retreat and wash the pot. I had to look up what the meaning of the metaphor, wash the pot, or the euphemism metaphor, or the euphemism for wash the pot meant. And it means to, kind of come clean, to, as we might say in the American South, to get right with God, to make a repentance. They had contacted a priest who will make an appearance at the end of this story, who's essentially going to go and hear their confession. The plot is, among Mr. McCoy, Mr. Cunningham, Mr. Power, to kind of, well, not exactly trick Mr. Kernan to coming, but get Mr. Kernan to come and then get him right with God. In the course of their hatching the plan, another man, Mr. Fogarty, comes to pay a visit on Mr. Kernan. Mr. Fogarty is a relatively successful a grocer who brings with him a half pint of what they refer to as special whiskey. There are a lot of things that are going on in this scene with those 5 men, Mr. Kernan, Mr. Power, Mr. Cunningham, Mr. McCoy, and Mr. Fogarty. The conversation here is really brilliant, and this is a great example of Joyce's ability to use dialogue to create characters, to carry along the plot, to create the subtextual meaning of his story, because these men discuss all kinds of things. In the course of discussing them, they drink. Mrs. Kernan brings up 4 pints of stout, which the men drink, and then Mr. Fogarty brings that half pint of special whiskey, and as they drink, their tongues loosen, as will happen among people when they drink, and their conversation covers a wide area of things. Mr. Kernan makes it clear that he resents the presence of people from the countryside in the city of Dublin taking on airs and acting above themselves. I don't know if you know this or not, but up until probably fairly recently, probably as recently the 1990s, people in the city of Dublin had a tendency to think about people from the countryside as being kind of country bumpkins and being a little unsophisticated and maybe a little crass. That's conveyed in this story. There's a discussion of usury here, where an unnamed character who Mr. Kernan was meeting on the night in which he got really drunk and fell down was a moneylender. So there's the issue of usury there. There are class differences between the 3 men. Mr. Power clearly feels himself to be above Mr. McCoy, and so he doesn't think Mr. McCoy should be using his first name. And Mr. Power of the 5 men is probably the snobbiest. Mr. Cunningham, we find out, has a wife who drinks, and he's been tolerating and trying to deal with that for much of his life. He's a more intelligent man, a more learned man, in the opinion of the others, so they listen to him. Mr. McCoy is a man who's kind of settled to his level in life, who had once had a chance to do perhaps some extraordinary things, and then kind of found his way to a lower level of society. Still somewhat respectable, but definitely not a man on his way up. Mr. Fogarty is a man who has established a successful small business person, and therefore is worthy of that respect, and Mr. Kernan owes him money. It comes out in the course of this discussion that Mr. Kernan had been a Protestant, but had converted to Catholicism to marry his wife, and that conversion, while he was sincere in it, it still hasn't quite taken, as will be indicated later on in the story. And so we're kind of left with this idea of all of these men coming to visit Mr. Kernan, who is down on his luck, who's fallen, clearly, in some way, and they're all trying to help him. And so I think we're kind of given the idea that this is done out of the goodness of their hearts, and these are men who are really looking out for a friend. And I don't want to discount that idea. But there's a twist at the end, as Alan will tell you is true, with lots of stories in Dubliners. In the course of this conversation, they talk about Catholic Church history, and they make a lot of mistakes in the history of the Catholic Church, in the kind of dogma of the Catholic Church, and they just kind of get carried away with themselves in agreeing with one another about things that aren't true, and just kind of bungling a lot of church history, which indicates that, while these men have come for a religious purpose to save Mr. Kernan, they're really not quite up on his religion as they seem to be. Near the end, when they describe this retreat they want to take Mr. Kernan on, they talk about what would be required. So this is the retreat to wash the pot, to get right with God, that they kind of tricked Mr. Kernan into agreeing to going to. All we have to do, said Mr. Cunningham, is to stand up with lighted candles in our hand and renew our baptismal vows. Oh, don't forget the candle, Tom, said Mr. McCoy, whatever you do. What, said Mr. Kernan? Must I have a candle? Oh, yes, said Mr. Cunningham. No, damn it all, said Mr. Kernan sensibly. I draw the line there. I'll do the job right enough. I'll do the retreat business and confession and all that business, but no candles. No, damn it all, I bar the candles. He shook his head with farcical gravity. Listen to that, said his wife. I bar the candles, Mr. Kernan, conscious of having created an effect on his audience and continuing to shake his head to and fro. I bar the magic lantern business. Everybody laughed. There's a nice Catholic for you, said his wife. So this is, kind of a humorous way of Mr. Kernan indicating that he's still not quite comfortable with all the aspects of Catholicism. So they plan to go to this retreat. You're kind of left with this idea that these guys may be a little drunk, maybe a little inebriated, maybe a little bit, not so far above Mr. Kernan as they seem to think they are still out to do something good, strictly for Mr. Kernan. And then the scene changes to church, in which all the men are again present. And they're all listening to the very priest who they had planned to have go on this retreat and essentially listen to their confessions. His sermon that day is is from the book of Luke, chapter 16, verse 9. And here's the text that he reads as he reads it. For the children of this world are wiser in their generation than the children of light. Wherefore, make unto yourselves friends out of the mammon of iniquity, so that when you die they may receive you into everlasting dwellings. So, the way in which Father Purdon interprets this is that you kind of need to look at your soul and like going to heaven like you look at your business ledger. And you need to balance the two. You need to balance your pursuit of money with your charitable actions. And that if you do this, that will, help you get into heaven. That those good deeds, if they balance out with the bad things you did, that will help you get into heaven. This actually comes close to a practice, one of those things that Joyce kind of finds to be hypocritical about the Catholic Church, because it comes really close to the idea of simony, the idea of being able to essentially buy indulgences, to buy forgiveness for past sins as a way of getting into heaven. And so here we have Father Purdon doing that. Another way of looking at that verse from the Bible will sound similar, but in important ways it's different. And that is the idea that you should use your money to do good works. And that the good works you do will be good for your soul and therefore help you get into heaven. And it puts a twist in the story. What have these these 3 or 4 guys been up to? What have Mr. Power, Mr. Cunningham, Mr. McCoy, and even Mr. Fogarty been up to? Have they just been helping Mr. Kernan out of the goodness of their hearts, or have they been helping Mr. Kernan in an effort to alleviate some of their own sins, of which they each have many, and as a way to get themselves into heaven? Anyway, there's the story of grace, and essentially maybe these men's efforts to buy a little grace by doing good deeds for one of their friends who's fallen on harder times. Anyway, cheers and happy St. Patrick's Day. Sláinte to everyone out there. Hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think about it in the comment section. As always, thanks for watching.